National Council of Provinces has gone under by getting its work done in the first sitting by electing a chairperson. And that chairperson is Refilwe Mngomezulu, the former premier of the province of Mpumalanga. However, the question is, will the National Council of Province be susceptible to the same level of political dynamics that we see in the National Assembly? The National Council of Province consists of 90 seats. Not all of them are permanent delegates. Many of them are special seats, special delegates that provinces will redelegate whenever they see fit to do so, according to what their interest as a province may be, depending on the business of each provincial legislature. Joining me to unpack this further is Professor Bheki Mngomezulu, Director of the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism. Prof, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Perhaps let's start here. The National Council of Province really is a product of the Westminster parliamentary system, where you have a lower house and an upper house, and one house represents a different constituency configuration than the other, which in this instance is a provincial constituency configuration. How important is the work in the greater scheme of parliamentary work of lawmaking and accountability is the National Council of Provinces?
Thanks, Oliver, for having me, and good evening to your viewers. First of all, please allow me to express my sincere condolence to the family of Mamutu Dumien following her passing. And then secondly, allow me to congratulate Dr. Ramutoba in Limpopo for being the first female premier of that province. And then thirdly, of course, to congratulate Mamu Refilwe Mngomezulu for being the chair of the NCOP. To come to your question, yes, indeed, most of the structures we have in our political institutions are not of our making. We inherited them from the old order. The Westminster Constitution that you just referred to is what is basically directing our activities across the African continent. You recall that the late King Sobhuza II of Eswatini, for example, welcomed the same Westminster Constitution, but then after assessing it, he realized that it was not working for his people, and then he declared the 1973 decree saying that he was doing away with that. Of course, you know what the consequences have been. So for the rest of the continent, including South Africa, we have embraced these arrangements, and then we've taken them as a truism, as if there is nothing else that we can do. In terms of a division of responsibilities, most of the work is done by the National Assembly. But then because you have 9 provinces, you recall that initially there was a debate as to whether South Africa was going to be a unitary state or a federal state. And then, of course, to try and meet both parties together or halfway, we ended up having 6 provinces, which were subsequently increased to 9. So the 90 that you are referring to, 10 come from each province, 6 of which will be permanent and the other 3 are not, and then we have 10 coming from SALGA to then collectively give you 100. So what will happen then is that most of the bills will be discussed in the National Assembly, and then certain bills will be then sent to the NCOP, from where they will go to the president, who will either assent his signature or refer the bill to the Constitutional Court for an opinion, or refer it back to Parliament for further discussion. So I would say that in terms of a division of responsibilities, it's clear who does what. So one does not interfere on the work of the other.
Yeah. So the NCOP passes any of its work and makes any of its decision based on 5 provinces being in agreement of whatever the motion may be before it. Of course, in an instance, in certain other decisions it needs to make, the threshold is 6 provinces being in agreement there too. And of course, Section 65 of the Constitution spells out to us exactly what the limitations of the decision-making power of the NCOP might be. But we now find ourselves in an interesting politics. A politics defined by negotiation, power sharing, and consensus seeking. This is because there isn't an outright majority in at least 3 provinces in the country at the moment, and there isn't an outright majority for the ANC in the National Assembly in that instance. You may find a situation where the ANC remains the executive the party at least in control of the executive branch of the state, that is to say the president, but it may have a situation one day in politics where it doesn't have control over those 5 provinces, and even then the work of the NCOP becomes a lot more contentious than it's ever been before. How much scrutiny is going to be on the work of the NCOP this time around? We've always thought of it as a merely ceremonial part of the lawmaking process, but now it becomes a substantive part. Would you agree?
You know, Oliver, not having a party with an outright majority is both good and bad. It's good in the sense that we are not going to have a party dominating the affairs of parliament, be it the National Assembly or the NCOP that we're talking about right now. Then it means, therefore, that other voices will also have to be heard. But the downside of it is that our politicians, some of them are not mature enough to see the bigger picture. So they might spend a lot of time basically debating amongst themselves, pushing their political agendas, agreeing on certain things for political expediency without necessarily taking the interests of the country first. So that is the downside of it. One can only hope that the politicians that have been saying negative things about the ANC will this time around be in a position to assist the ANC do things the right way, now that it is not in the majority, both in the National Assembly and also in the NCOP. And then wait and see how the cabinet will look like. But then what will happen there is that you need politicians who are sober-minded, politicians who are not going to push their own personal interests or party interests, but who are going to push the interests of the country first. Do we have that caliber of leaders? At the moment, my answer is no. I'm saying this simply because you would have seen when they were canvassing, there are certain things they said about one another that gave you as a voter the impression that under no circumstances would Party A work with Party B. Now, and after the election, they are claiming that we have decided to work together for the sake of the country, which is not true. We know that they're doing that for their own interests, not for your interest, not for my interest. So what will happen then in the NCOP will be a combination of all those factors, and everything will boil down to the caliber of the leadership that each province has deployed to the NCOP. And then, of course, it will be influenced by what happens in the National Assembly, because what happens in the National Assembly will, in one way or the other, translate itself also in the NCOP, given that we are talking about the same political parties that are represented in both houses.
Yeah, the NCOP has been incredibly instrumental and important in safeguarding against the inadvertent federalization of South Africa as a state, right? And you mentioned there the debate in 1994 was, do we go a unitary direction or do we go a federal direction? And because it has been so instrumental in safeguarding against the federalization of the state, it has kept our democracy intact for a very large part. But when provinces, where the politics in provinces begin to split in different directions, it is natural that provinces begin to have different interests that may not align to the national interest in entirety. Can you conceive of a situation where certain provinces frustrate the lawmaking process and the business of the National Council of Provinces in a way that brings about a fractured federalization inadvertently, of course, not directly so? To give you an example more concretely, can you imagine that Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, as provinces with no outright majority, can at some point frustrate that process?
With the caliber of leaders that we have, the answer is in the affirmative. Yes, we can expect that. Like you correctly pointed out earlier on, that there are instances where you would need 5 of 9 provinces for that decision to be accepted, and in some instances you would need 6. Now, if you say, if in a situation where these provinces don't see eye to eye on certain issues, or in fact they do agree on substance, but because of their political differences, they are just weighing each other's powers, we may find that you will struggle to reach the threshold, either a threshold of 5 or a threshold of 6, depending on the bill that is being debated at the time. And then, of course, recall that when these members of the NCOP go to the NCOP chamber, they are going there with a mandate from their provinces. And then, of course, it means that from each province, you also have a mandate from your own political party. Ordinarily, you would expect that members of the NCOP should not be carrying the mandate from their political parties, but instead from their provincial legislature. That is what should be happening, hypothetically speaking, or ordinarily. But in the real sense of the word, sometimes you find that political influences creep in and therefore they derail the process, which is the same thing that you find in the National Assembly. You are a political party, and then of course you send people there and you hope that they are going to represent your interests, and then they are co-opted by others, and then they end up doing something totally different, which would not surprise you, by the way, Oliver, because when these political parties go to national conferences, delegates go to national conferences with a clear mandate from their branches, but when they arrive at those conference venues, they change gear, either because they are persuaded or because they are bribed or any other reason. The reality is the message that they were given at their point of departure is a different one which they deliver on the day.
Yeah. Local government has some discursive voice represented in the National Council of Province through the 10 seats assigned to SALGA, which represents local governments. I say discursive because it's not a substantive voice in that those 10 seats are non-voting seats. So they effectively can't vote in bills or any of the substantive decisions to be made in the National Council of Provinces. But local government is also deeply fractured as far as its coalition politics are concerned in the country. We saw just in the last week or so, the MMC of Finance in Ekurhuleni, for instance, was removed. We saw the mayor of City of eThekwini, for instance, finding himself in a predicament as well when it comes to his leadership and constituency over there. SALGA's voice then becomes a little bit more important, given that the national politics also takes the shape of a fractured, coalesced politics altogether. Do you think that at some point we must have a conversation about giving constitutional powers to those 10 seats that are assigned to SALGA that represents the voice of local government to make them voting seats instead of what they currently are, non-voting seats?
Ideally, Hugo, that would be a brilliant idea. But unfortunately, for you to do that, you would need a 2/3 majority in order to effect a constitutional amendment, given that you cannot change a constitution unless you have a 2/3 majority. And this time around, that is difficult to do. But ideally, that would indeed be a brilliant idea, because SALGA is closest to the people, and their number, of course, is 10, equivalent to the 10 that come from each province. But in terms of powers, as you correctly pointed out, they are not voting members. So if we were to then go to a situation whereby we give them a vote, so that at least not only do they deliberate on the issues, but they also take a stance when crunch time comes, you may then hope that things will change for the better, assuming, of course, that they are going to operate objectively and in the interest of the country.
Professor Bheki Mngomezulu, Director of the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism, was our guest there. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. Really do appreciate it. Always a brilliant interlocutor to engage.